Consider yourself restructured, Elliot declared, standing at the head of the mahogany conference table like a Roman emperor about to exile a senator. Except instead of a thumbs down, he pointed a Mont Blanc pen at me and announced, "Effective immediately, Diane, HR will escort you out." The air conditioning hummed its steady 64 degrees. Crystal water pitchers caught the afternoon light. 8 partners sat frozen around the table, their expressions carefully neutral in that way investment bankers perfect by their 3rd year. This 32-year-old in his Hermes tie and custom Brioni suit had just terminated me in front of the entire executive committee, while checking his Patek Philippe, while calling it portfolio optimization of human capital. I didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing 23 years of loyalty crack. After more than 2 decades managing institutional relationships, you learn that panic is just poor risk assessment. And I had assessed every risk in this room years ago. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out the slim leather folder I'd carried since 1999, the same folder that contained signature cards, authorization codes, and fiduciary documentation for every major client relationship I'd built from nothing. I set it on the table like a dealer laying down a royal flush. "Best of luck with the transition," I said. Elliot smirked, like he'd just closed a hostile takeover. Like I was some back-office clerk who'd finally been shown the door. But here's what Elliot didn't know, what nobody in that boardroom knew. That folder wasn't just paperwork. It contained custodial authorizations, fiduciary designations, and legally binding signature authorities that connected this firm to $900 million in institutional assets. Some of those relationships didn't even have backup contacts on file anymore. They existed entirely through trust that started and ended with my name. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Diane Holloway. I'm 56 years old. For the last 23 years, I've been the managing director of institutional client services at Whitmore Capital Partners. That title sounds prestigious until you realize what it actually means. I'm the person who keeps the pension funds happy, the one who maintains the relationships that prevent $900 million from walking out the door to our competitors, the one who handles the quarterly reviews, the compliance documentation, and the 17 different regulatory filings that allow us to manage other people's money. I'm the invisible thread that holds the client relationships together. Whitmore Capital Partners is a mid-sized investment advisory firm in Boston. We manage assets for state pension systems, university endowments, union retirement funds, and family offices. When a firefighter in Worcester retires, there's a good chance his pension check comes from investments I've personally overseen. $900 million in assets under management, 47 institutional clients, 17 different fiduciary relationships that require specific documentation and designated points of contact. If our clients lose confidence, they pull their money. If they pull their money, we lose management fees. If we lose management fees, the firm collapses. No pressure. The investment advisory industry runs on trust. Returns matter, but trust matters more. A client might tolerate a down quarter, but they won't tolerate feeling ignored. They won't tolerate being handed off to someone who doesn't know their specific needs, their board dynamics, their risk tolerance. I've spent 23 years building that trust, learning the names of board members' grandchildren, remembering which pension administrator prefers morning calls and which one only takes meetings after 2 p.m., knowing that the Worcester Firefighters Fund gets nervous about emerging market exposure and that the Massachusetts teacher's pension needs quarterly reports if it's formatted in a very specific way. Most people's eyes glaze over when I explain what I do. Mine light up. Because I understand something that the MBAs and the consultants and the private equity sharks never seem to grasp. The relationships aren't overhead. They're the product. You can have the best investment returns in the industry. You can have algorithms that predict market movements with supernatural accuracy. You can have offices that look like they belong in Architectural Digest. But without trusted relationships and proper fiduciary documentation, You're just a stranger asking people to hand over their retirement savings. Here's the thing. Elliot and his disruptive innovation mentality didn't bother to learn SEC regulations require registered investment advisors to maintain designated contact persons for institutional clients. These designations involve specific fiduciary responsibilities, compliance documentation, and legally binding signature authorities. The firm's ability to manage client assets depends on having those designated relationships properly documented and maintained. 3 guesses whose name was on 47 different fiduciary designation forms. The office smelled like leather and coffee and money when I walked through it that last morning. I'd arrived at 6 a.m. like I always did, checked the overnight market summaries, reviewed the client communication queue, made sure nothing had fallen through the cracks. The morning shift was trickling in, analysts reviewing portfolios, associates preparing presentation decks. The quiet hum of a financial advisory firm waking up to chase another day's returns. Let me tell you how I got here, because you need to understand what Elliot was really destroying. 23 years ago, Whitmore Capital Partners was struggling to break into the institutional market. A boutique firm with good returns but no credibility with the big pension funds. They'd been rejected by every major institutional investor in New England. I was 33. Working at the Massachusetts Pension Reserves Investment Management Board as a compliance analyst. I was the person who reviewed investment advisor applications and decided which firms were trustworthy enough to manage public employee retirement funds. I knew what made institutional investors say yes. I knew what made them say no. I knew the unwritten rules that separated credible firms from pretenders. The founder of Whitmore at the time was a man named Charles Whitmore. Old school. Started as a bond trader. Built the firm from a single office above a dry cleaner. Understood that asset management was about stewardship, not just returns. He offered me triple my government salary to come build an institutional business from scratch. I need someone who knows how these pension boards think, Charles told me. Someone who can get us in the door and keep us there. That someone was me. The first year was brutal. I cold called every pension fund administrator in New England. Got rejected 200 times. But I kept building relationships, kept showing up, kept demonstrating that Whitmore Capital Partners would treat their money like it was our own. Our first institutional client was the Worcester Firefighters Pension Fund, $42 million. I still remember the day we signed the paperwork. Charles opened a bottle of champagne and told me I had a job for life. He meant it. He really did. But then Charles retired, and then the firm got acquired. And then the private equity money showed up with spreadsheets and efficiency initiatives. 3 ownership changes later, here came Elliot. But before I tell you how I watched his entire house of cards collapse, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a like. The algorithm feeds on engagement, and honestly, you're going to want witnesses for what comes next. Done good. Let's get back to our boy wonder. Elliot Ashworth wasn't earned. He was inherited. His father, Richard Ashworth, ran the private equity firm that had acquired Whitmore Capital Partners 2 years ago. Beacon Hill Capital Partners. Old money masquerading as smart money. Elliot had never built anything in his life. He'd been installed, parachuted in on a golden thread of family connections and an MBA from Wharton that his father's donation had probably subsidized. He'd never cold-called a pension administrator, never sat through a 4-hour board presentation defending investment decisions, never had to look a retired teacher in the eye and explain why her retirement fund had underperformed. He thought asset management was just spreadsheets with better fonts. He arrived at Whitmore with a laptop full of McKinsey slides and a mandate to cut 30% from the operating budget, 30%. From a firm that was already running lean, from relationships that had taken decades to build. He floated in on a cloud of disruption buzzwords and generational wealth. Suits that cost more than an analyst's monthly salary, a Porsche in the parking garage while the associates took the tea. The kind of confidence that only comes from never having faced real consequences. I remember his first client meeting, The Massachusetts Teachers' Pension Board had requested a quarterly review. These were people who'd entrusted us with $300 million in retirement savings for 60,000 public school teachers. Elliot showed up 20 minutes late. Checked his phone twice during the presentation, called the pension administrator Buddy, and suggested they should move faster on approving our new fee structure. The administrator, a 60-year-old man named Frank who'd been managing pension investments since before Elliot was born, stared at him like he'd suggested they invest the teacher's retirement in cryptocurrency. "We'll take that under advisement," Frank said, in a tone that meant they'd be reviewing our contract at the next board meeting. That was Elliot, completely disconnected from the reality of what we actually did. His official title was Chief Executive Officer. What he actually did was attend conferences, interrupt people who were trying to maintain client relationships, and make decisions based on whatever fintech article he'd skimmed that morning. First month, he eliminated the client relations team because technology can handle relationship management now. Technology could not handle it. Technology could. 3 institutional clients requested in-person meetings to concerns about firm direction. 3 clients representing $180 million in assets. Elliot blamed market volatility and moved on. Second month, he outsourced our compliance documentation to a firm in Delaware to save money. The firm in Delaware didn't understand our client relationships. They filed incorrect paperwork with the SEC. We got flagged for a documentation audit. The SEC doesn't mess around. That's a regulatory investigation. Third month, he decided the Institutional Client Services Department was bloated. We had 4 people maintaining relationships with 47 institutional clients managing $900 million. The industry standard was twice that. Elliot didn't care about industry standards. He cared about the 30%. He cared about impressing his father in Boston, so he could prove he wasn't just riding coattails. I tried to warn him. Once. "Elliot," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "These institutional relationships aren't just names on a spreadsheet. These are pension boards with fiduciary obligations. They have specific documentation requirements. They need designated contacts they can trust." He looked at me like I'd suggested we go back to sending stock certificates by horse-drawn carriage. "Diane," he said, pronouncing my name like it was a legacy system he wanted to deprecate. "I've studied transformation at the best business school in the country. I think I understand modernization." He didn't. He really didn't. But I was the biggest line item in his bloated spreadsheet. 23 years of experience meant 23 years of salary increases, benefits, pension contributions. On paper, I was expensive. On paper, I was redundant. What the paper didn't show was that my name was the only thing standing between this firm and a mass client exodus. The meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m. on a Wednesday. I knew what was coming. You don't spend 23 years reading boardrooms and financial regulations without developing a sixth sense for danger. The whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by. The HR emails that copied people who shouldn't have been copied. Elliot's assistant scheduling a conference room for strategic alignment discussion when no discussion was due. I dressed carefully that morning. My best Chanel suit, comfortable false heels. Nothing that would look disheveled when they walked me out past the Bloomberg terminals I'd watched flicker for 23 years. I also made copies of certain documents, not proprietary information, not client data, just my own records, my fiduciary designations, my signature authorities. The client contact documentation I'd maintained for over 2 decades. The conference room had that old money elegance Whitmore had cultivated since the beginning. Mahogany table, oil paintings of ships, the kind of aesthetic that told pension boards their money was in steady hands. Elliot sat at the head of the table, flanked by the head of HR and a lawyer from his father's firm. The lawyer was young, probably thought fiduciary duty was just a buzzword. 3 against 1. They'd brought backup for a 56-year-old woman in a Chanel suit. Elliot didn't stand when I entered. He was reviewing something on his tablet, probably checking his Robinhood portfolio. "Diane," he said, finally glancing up. "We've been reviewing our organizational architecture. Here it comes. As you know, we're implementing significant efficiency initiatives across all operations. After careful analysis, we've determined that your function no longer aligns with our strategic imperatives." Strategic imperatives. He said it like client relationships were optional. Like the trust I'd built over 23 years was a line item to be optimized. "The responsibilities of your position will be distributed among the remaining team, supported by our new automated client management platform." I almost laughed. Automated client management platform. For relationships with pension board members who'd known me since their children were in diapers. For fiduciary responsibilities that required human judgment and institutional knowledge. "Your severance package is outlined in this document." The HR director slid a folder across the mahogany. 12 weeks salary. Continuation of health benefits for 60 days. And a standard release agreement. 12 weeks. 23 years of service. And they were offering me 12 weeks. I opened the folder, scanned the numbers, closed it. The lawyer shifted in his seat. He'd expected me to argue, to cry, to negotiate. I did none of those things. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" Elliot asked, already back to his tablet. I looked at him. Really looked. At his Hermes tie and his confident smirk and his total, absolute ignorance of what he'd just done. "Just one question," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Have you reviewed our Form ADV filings recently?" Elliot frowned. "What?" "The Form ADV. The SE registration document that allows us to operate as an investment advisor. The one that lists designated contact persons for institutional client relationships. I don't see what that has to do with. You should probably look at Item 4, specifically the supervised persons section, and then cross-reference it with our institutional client agreements." Silence in the room. The kind of silence that happens when people realize they might have missed something critical. "What are you talking about?" Elliot demanded. I stood up, smoothed my jacket, picked up my portfolio. "I'm talking about the fact that SEC regulations require investment advisors to maintain designated relationship managers for institutional clients. Specific individuals, named in the Form ADV, who have passed specific compliance examinations, whose names appear on fiduciary documentation that institutional clients have signed and their boards have approved." The lawyer's eyes widened. He was starting to understand. Elliot wasn't. "So we'll designate someone else." "It's just updating some paperwork." Changing designated contact persons requires client notification. It requires board approval at many of these pension funds, and when 47 institutional clients simultaneously receive notification that their designated relationship manager has been terminated without transition, they tend to ask questions. "That's absurd. Your platform can't testify at a pension board meeting. Your platform can't explain to a room full of retired teachers why their fund manager just fired the only person they trusted." I walked toward the door, stopped, turned back, turned. "The Worcester Firefighters Board meets on Friday. The Massachusetts Teachers Board meets next Tuesday. I'm sure your automated platform will do beautifully." I walked out of that conference room with my head high and my heart pounding. Behind me, I heard Elliot's voice, already dismissive. "What was that about? Some kind of boomer guilt trip." The HR director murmured something about change resistance. The lawyer was pulling out his phone, starting to Google something, starting to realize they had no idea, not yet, but they would. The thing about fiduciary relationships is that nobody reads the documentation until something goes wrong. For 23 years, every institutional client agreement, every Form ADV filing, Every fiduciary acknowledgement had my name on it, not because I was the only one who could sign them, but because I was the only one these clients trusted. The designations weren't just paperwork, they were relationships. When Beacon Hill Capital acquired Whitmore, their lawyers had done due diligence on the financial stuff, management fees, performance track record, real estate valuations. What they hadn't done was audit the relationship structure. They assumed client loyalty would transfer automatically. They assumed wrong. SEC regulations require registered investment advisors to maintain designated relationship managers for institutional clients. These managers must pass compliance examinations. Their names appear on official filings. Any changes require proper notification and transition procedures. But more importantly, institutional clients are pension boards and endowment committees made up of human beings. Human beings who don't trust algorithms, who don't trust platforms, who trust people they've known for decades. I held designated contact authority for 47 institutional clients, every major relationship Whitmore had built since I'd arrived. $900 million in assets connected to my name, my reputation, my 23 years of face-to-face relationship building. All of it walked out the door with me, which meant that as of 3:22 p.m. on that Wednesday, Whitmore Capital Partners was about to send 47 termination notices to pension boards and endowment committees across New England. In the investment advisory industry, that's not just a paperwork problem. That's a mass exodus problem. I drove home slowly, took the long way along the Charles River, stopped for tea at my favorite place in Cambridge. The server knew my order by heart. Earl Grey, light milk, extra hot. I sat by the window and watched the late afternoon light paint the water gold. My phone buzzed. My son, checking in. I texted back that everything was fine. I'd call him later. Everything was fine. It really was. Because I knew exactly what was about to happen. My townhouse in Brookline had been in my family for 3 generations. Crown molding, original hardwood, a library where I'd spent countless evenings preparing for client presentations. I poured myself a glass of Sancerre, sat in my reading chair, and opened my laptop. The company email still worked. Nobody had thought to revoke my access yet. I watched the chaos unfold in real time. Has anyone heard from Diane? The Worcester Fund is calling about Friday's meeting. The SEC compliance portal is showing incomplete documentation. Weren't we supposed to file updated Form ADV by end of month? Frank from the teacher's pension just called. He sounds concerned. What do I tell him? They were unraveling, and I wasn't even touching anything. Just watching the systems do what they always did when the person holding them together quietly stepped away. Elliot thought he'd fired a glorified secretary with a Rolodex. What he'd actually done was cut the main artery of client trust and handed a tourniquet to an intern who didn't know which end was up. I took another sip of wine. Tomorrow I'd make some calls. But tonight, I let the silence settle, because for the first time in 23 years, I didn't owe that firm anything. And somehow, that felt louder than any speech I could have given in that boardroom. By the next morning, the panic had begun. I was making breakfast when my phone started lighting up. Former colleagues, industry contacts, old friends from my pension board days. The word was spreading, fast. Elliot had apparently spent the previous evening trying to figure out what I'd meant about the Form ADV filings. He'd called the compliance team at 9 p.m. The compliance team had called their securities lawyers at 5 a.m. The news wasn't good. Whitmore was required to notify all institutional clients within 30 days of any change in designated relationship managers. The notifications would trigger board reviews at most pension funds. Many of those boards had explicit clauses requiring approval for any material change in the advisory relationship. Approval. from pension boards that would be very interested to learn that their trusted contact of 23 years had been fired in a conference room with 12 weeks severance. Elliot called me at 7:18 a.m. I let it go to voicemail. His message was clipped. Diane, this is Elliot. We need to discuss transition protocols. Call me back as soon as possible. He called again at 7:34 and 7:51 and 8:09. At 8:30, he started texting. Diane, we need to talk. This is time sensitive. Please respond. There appears to be some confusion about client notification requirements. Confusion. That was cute. I made myself another cup of tea and watched the notifications pile up. The first real crack appeared at 9 a.m. when Frank from the Massachusetts Teachers' Pension called Whitmore's main line and asked to speak with me. The receptionist, following new protocols, informed him that I was no longer with the firm and offered to connect him with our automated client services platform. Frank, who had been managing pension investments since 1987, who had personally approved Whitmore's initial engagement based on my recommendation, who had attended my son's college graduation party, hung up. He called back 10 minutes later and asked to speak with whoever was now responsible for the Teachers Fund relationship. Nobody knew. By 10 a.m., Frank had placed calls to 3 other pension administrators in his network. By 11, rumors were circulating through the New England pension community that Whitmore Capital Partners had undergone significant changes in the investment advisory world. Significant changes is code for consider your options. The Worcester Firefighters Board meeting happened on Friday as scheduled. Elliot didn't attend. He sent a junior associate with a PowerPoint deck. The board asked where I was. The associate said I had transitioned to new opportunities. The board asked who their new designated contact would be. The associate couldn't answer. The board asked to see updated compliance documentation. The associate had brought the wrong files. The meeting lasted 18 minutes. At the end, the board voted unanimously to issue a formal request for information to Whitmore Capital Partners in pension fund language. That's the first step toward terminating an advisory relationship. $42 million. The very first institutional client I'd brought to Whitmore. The relationship that had started everything. And it was slipping away because Elliot thought relationship management could be automated. By the following Tuesday, the Massachusetts Teachers Board had joined them. A formal RFI. $300 million now officially under review. Elliot tried calling me again. This time, his voice was different, less confident, more desperate. Diane, we need to discuss a consulting arrangement. We need you at these board meetings. My consulting rate is $1,500 per hour with a minimum retainer of $50,000. Silence. That's outrageous. That's below market rate for institutional relationship recovery. I'm offering a discount because I actually care about the retirees whose pensions your firm manages. This is blackmail. No, Elliot, this is the market your MBA taught you to worship. You eliminated my position because I was too expensive. Now you're discovering what expensive actually looks like. I hung up, turned off my phone, made myself lunch, let them scramble. The offers started escalating on day 5. First, they agreed to my consulting rate. I declined. Then they offered to rehire me at double my previous salary. I declined. Then Richard Ashworth himself, Elliot's father, the man who ran Beacon Hill Capital, flew from Boston to my townhouse. He showed up at my door with a bottle of Chateau Margaux and a contract. I didn't let him in. Mrs. Holloway, please, let's be reasonable about this. I am being reasonable, Mr. Ashworth. Your son fired me in front of the executive committee without understanding what I did. He assumed 23 years of fiduciary relationships could be replaced by an app. He was wrong. We made a mistake. We're trying to correct it. You're trying to protect your investment. There's a difference. I closed the door. What I didn't decline was a phone call from a woman named Victoria Chen. Victoria was the CEO of Granite State Investment Advisors, one of Whitmore's main competitors. She'd been trying to recruit me for years. I'd always said no because I was loyal to Charles Whitmore's legacy. Loyalty. What a quaint concept. I heard what happened, Victoria said. I'm sorry. Don't be. It's the best thing that could have happened. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. I have a proposition. Granite State was expanding their institutional business. They just won a mandate from a major state pension system and needed someone to build out their client services operation. Someone who understood pension boards. Someone who had relationships across New England. Someone who knew where every fiduciary body was buried. We want you as Executive Vice President of Institutional Services, Victoria said. Complete authority over client relationships, equity stake in the firm, board seat within 2 years. When do you need an answer? Yesterday. But I can give you until Monday. I took the weekend. The job was everything Whitmore should have been. Better title, better compensation, actual ownership stake. Real authority? A seat at the table where decisions got made, and the satisfaction of watching Elliot try to explain to his father how he'd endangered $900 million in client assets by firing the wrong person. Meanwhile, the cascade at Whitmore was accelerating. The SEC documentation audit that Elliot's outsourced compliance firm had triggered, it was expanding. Investigators had noticed discrepancies in the Form ADV filings, missing signatures, incomplete transition documentation, the kind of paperwork problems that make regulators very curious about what else might be wrong. The quarterly compliance committee meeting happened on day 10. Elliot showed up with his usual confidence, still believing this was just a temporary setback. He sat at the head of the mahogany table, checking his phone, and interrupted the general counsel mid-sentence. Wait, why is Diane Holloway's name still on all these documents? She doesn't even work here anymore. The general counsel, a man named Robert Walsh, who'd been with the firm since Charles Whitmore's days, looked at Elliot like he'd just asked why they needed licenses to manage money. You're joking, right? Elliot blinked. Just change it to someone else. Robert didn't blink back. She's listed as the designated relationship manager on 47 institutional client agreements. Her signature appears on fiduciary acknowledgement documents that pension boards have approved and filed with their state regulators. Her name is on Form ADV filings submitted to the SEC. Elliot made a face like someone had spilled coffee on his Hermes tie. So, update the forms. Sir, that's not how this works. Turns out you can't just swap names on CETIC filings like contact cards in a Rolodex. It requires formal amendments, client notifications, board approvals, and regulatory review. The process takes months, and pension boards don't approve changes to designated relationship managers without very good reasons. I was terminated without proper notification is not a good reason. It's an alarm bell. HR, in a spectacular display of incompetence, had already sent notifications to all 47 institutional clients, informing them that their designated relationship manager had departed the firm, no transition plan, no introduction to replacement contacts, just a form letter that might as well have said, your trusted advisor is gone, and we have no idea what we're doing. The responses came flooding in. 23 clients requested immediate meetings to discuss relationship continuity. 14 clients issued formal RFIs. 7 clients notified Whitmore that they would be evaluating their advisory relationship at the next board meeting. Then came the kill shot. The Massachusetts State Pension Fund, $300 million in assets, the crown jewel of Whitmore's institutional business, scheduled an emergency board meeting. Frank, the administrator I'd known for 2 decades, had recommended a full review of the Whitmore relationship. He'd cited material changes in client service infrastructure and concerns about fiduciary continuity. Their compliance officer requested updated documentation before the meeting. Standard due diligence. But when they ran a verification review, they found that every fiduciary acknowledgement, every designated contact authorization, every compliance certification still pointed to one name, Diane Holloway. No updates, no transitions, no backup designations. They reached out directly, not to Whitmore, to me. I answered honestly. I was terminated without transition protocols or proper succession planning. I am no longer affiliated with the firm and cannot verify the current state of their client service infrastructure. 3 days later, the Massachusetts State Pension Board voted 7-2 to issue a formal termination notice to Whitmore Capital Partners. $300 million. 20 years of relationship. Gone. Elliot saw red. At the next partner meeting, he did what insecure men in collapsing empires always do. He blamed me, called me the queen of paper shuffling, said I'd built a bureaucratic fortress to protect my own job, said modern firms didn't need relationship dinosaurs who confuse schmoozing for actual value. He said all this while the SEC was reviewing their documentation practices, and 47 institutional clients were questioning their advisory relationships. Meanwhile, across town at Granite State, I was settling into a corner office with a view of Boston Harbor. Victoria had given me everything I'd asked for, better than I'd asked for, and I had a front row seat to watch the Whitmore collapse. The final meeting wasn't listed on any calendar. It wasn't announced in the partner bulletin. It wasn't preceded by an inspirational email about navigating change. This was the kind of meeting that happens behind closed mahogany doors, with phones surrendered at the entrance and voices kept low even when billions are at stake. Everyone who mattered was there. Richard Ashworth, looking like a man watching his legacy burn. The full Whitmore board. 3 different law firms specializing in securities regulations, fiduciary liability, and crisis management. And Elliot, looking like a man who'd finally realized he wasn't the protagonist of this story. His Brioni suit was wrinkled, his confidence had evaporated like morning fog. The smirk was gone, replaced by the hollow stare of someone who'd destroyed something he didn't understand. They'd spent 3 weeks trying to fix what he'd broken. $800,000 in consultant fees, emergency client visits, compliance remediation programs that couldn't possibly compress 23 years of relationship building into 23 days, and they were still hemorrhaging clients. The general counsel opened with one line, "You didn't fire an employee, you severed our institutional foundation." Then he started the autopsy, page after page, client after client, relationship after relationship, every fiduciary connection tied to my name. Worcester firefighters me, Massachusetts teachers me, Boston University endowment me, Hartford municipal employees me, 47 relationships, $900 million, all connected to a woman Elliot had dismissed as redundant overhead. "You fired her without succession planning," Robert said, slowly flipping through documentation. "Without client notification. Without transition protocols. And when she walked out, she took 23 years of fiduciary trust with her," Richard Ashworth asked, barely above a whisper. "How much have we lost?" Confirmed terminations total $370 million. Pending reviews represent another $400 million. If current trends continue, we'll lose majority of institutional AUM within 6 months. Richard's face went the color of old paper. The SEC investigation. Expanding. They've identified 17 documentation deficiencies. We're looking at potential fines and mandatory compliance restructuring. Elliot tried to speak, but there was nothing left to say. just a dry throat and a 1,000-yard stare aimed at the mahogany table where he'd ended my career 3 weeks ago. Richard looked at his son for a long moment. Whatever he saw there, it wasn't the leadership air he'd imagined installing. "You're done," Richard said. "Effective immediately. I'll handle your transition personally." Elliot's jaw dropped. "Dad, you can't." "I just did. The board voted to remove Elliot from his position unanimously, father included. He was walked out of the building the same way I'd been, past the Bloomberg terminals, past the mahogany conference room, past the oil paintings of ships that had weathered storms far worse than this. The receptionist, a woman named Helen who'd worked there since Charles Whitmore's days, watched him go. "Funny thing about this business," Helen told me later. "The clients don't care about your algorithms. They care about whether you actually give a damn about their retirement." Karma sometimes arrives in a Chanel suit. Whitmore Capital Partners survived. Barely. They brought in a crisis management firm from New York, former SEC officials, who charged a fortune and worked around the clock. It took them 6 months to stabilize the client base, but the damage was done. 17 institutional clients terminated their relationships. $400 million in assets walked out the door. The SEC investigation resulted in a formal censure and mandatory compliance restructuring. Richard Ashworth was forced out by his own investors 18 months later. The Whitmore disaster had cost Beacon Hill Capital over $60 million in lost fees and legal expenses. His succession planning had become a case study in private equity hubris. And Elliot, last I heard, he's doing consulting work. Financial Services Transformation Advisor. His LinkedIn says he helps firms navigate operational transitions. He has 74 followers, mostly from his Wharton class. He tried to connect with me on LinkedIn 2 months ago, sent a message saying he hoped there were no hard feelings and that he'd learned valuable lessons from the Whitmore experience. I didn't respond. Some lessons cost other people too much. I'm sitting in my corner office at Granite State now. The view overlooks Boston Harbor, boats cutting through the gray-blue water. We just closed our largest institutional mandate ever, the Rhode Island State Employees Retirement System. $600 million. They came to us specifically because they'd heard what happened at Whitmore. They wanted someone who valued relationships over algorithms, someone who understood that their retirement wasn't just a line item. Victoria gave me everything I asked for: authority, equity, a voice in how this firm operates. My name is on every major institutional relationship we have, every fiduciary acknowledgement, every designated contact authorization. Not because I demanded it, because Victoria understands something Elliot never did. The relationship manager isn't overhead. The relationship manager is the product. The person who makes everything else possible. The person who keeps pension boards confident that their retirees' money is in good hands. I have a team now. 8 people who report to me, dedicated professionals who understand that institutional asset management isn't just numbers on a screen. It's the difference between a retiree who can afford their medication and one who has to choose between groceries and prescriptions. One of them is Frank's daughter, Emily. She left the Massachusetts teacher's pension to join us, said she wanted to work somewhere that understood what fiduciary duty actually meant. Now she's my director of client relations, following in her father's footsteps, just on the other side of the table. My son came to visit the new office last month, walked through the trading floor with me, looked at the client wall where we display our institutional relationships. "Mom," he said, "you built something that matters here." I put my arm around him. I built something that lasts. That's what matters. Last week, a young relationship manager asked me what my secret was, how I'd built a career that gave me this kind of leverage. I told her the same thing. I'll tell you. Learn the boring stuff, the fiduciary regulations, the compliance requirements, the documentation details that make everyone's eyes glaze over. Because when everyone else is focused on the exciting stuff, the returns, the algorithms, The disruption strategies, the person who understands the boring stuff is the one who actually keeps the clients. Elliot thought he was cutting costs. He was cutting his own throat. Richard thought he was installing leadership. He was installing a demolition crew. And I thought I was losing everything. Turns out, I was just changing firms. The Boston sunset paints the harbor gold outside my window. I watch it every evening now. A small ritual, a reminder of how far I've come. 23 years at Whitmore, 12 weeks of severance, and now this. A corner office with a harbor view. Clients who trust what we do. A team that listens when I speak. Not bad for someone who was restructured. Sometimes the best revenge isn't anger. It's watching the sunset from your corner office while the people who tried to optimize you fade into irrelevance. Appreciate you sticking around, you wise old guardians of other people's money. Smash that subscribe button, or this fossil might just restructure your entire portfolio. And if you've got your own story about a trust fund kid who learned the hard way that relationships aren't obsolete, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. We fiduciary dinosaurs have to stick together.